While diplomatic flurry of activity continues to happen regarding the Russia-Ukraine war, and all sides, at least on paper and in public statements, say that they're looking to end the war itself continues on. And overnight, there was another large attack in the air into Kyiv from Russia. Actually, quite a number of places were attacked, but a number of spots were hit in Kyiv as well. And of course, it has all of the condemnations that many in the West often bring up. Certainly, the Zelensky has condemned it. It's just proving that Russia doesn't want to end the war. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, also, the United States is engaging in its own form of economic coercion against, of all people, India. Interesting how we've selected that well. To try to make sense of all this, where it's going, and what's really happening behind the scenes, we have back with us today one of our favorite guests, Professor John Mearsheimer, international relations theorist and professor of political science at the University of Chicago, and friend of the show. Professor, welcome back as always.
Thank you, Danny. As always, it's good to be back.
Well, listen, I mean, let's just jump right into that top issue right there about this big drone strike, because a lot of, really big imagery coming out. You saw that one blast. It was captured on camera there in the city of Kyiv. And then now you see a bunch of buildings that have been hit as well. And a lot of people say, oh, well, this proves that Russia doesn't want peace at all. What does it say to you?
Well, I mean, these arguments are kind of crazy. The Russians have made it clear from the beginning that they're not going to stop the war. They're going to continue to wage the war until they achieve their objectives. And one should therefore expect them to continue to launch air attacks against Ukraine and to continue to push forward on the battlefield. So there's nothing surprising here about what the Russians are doing. It doesn't represent any great change in their policy. What's going on, of course, is that you have a propaganda war that's taking place side by side with the actual war. And all of the complaints and all of the attention that's being given to these Russian attacks in the West is part and parcel of the propaganda war. What they're trying to do is make it look like the Russians are ruthless murderers, and the Russians, are the principal obstacle to peace, not the Europeans and the Ukrainians. And the fact is that the West and the Ukrainians are quite good at the propaganda war. The big problem they face is that the war that counts is the real war, the one on the battlefield, the one that involves these missile and airstrikes. And in that war, the Ukrainians are in deep trouble, and the situation just gets worse each day. So, you can just largely ignore this propaganda war because in the final analysis, it just doesn't mean much.
Now, let me ask you, speaking of the propaganda war and the claims made by the two sides, you have the Russian side claims, again, overnight, that they don't attack civilian infrastructure. They go after energy infrastructure, but otherwise it's military targets. And they claim that last night's attacks were into military structures. But at least of those pictures that you saw Gary showing there, seem to be a lot of houses and apartments and non-military buildings. What do you make of that?
I don't know what to say, Danny. I mean, I agree with your assessment of the pictures. And I've searched to see if I can figure out what the Russians are saying about the particular targets they're going after, but they're not saying anything explicit. So it's hard to know whether they were going after real targets and this was just collateral damage, or they've decided to take off the gloves and go after civilian targets. It seems to me that they're not waging what I would call a punishment campaign, where they're out to kill large numbers of civilians and do huge amounts of damage to apartment buildings and living places. Because if they were, they would end up killing more people. They are not killing that many people. It's regrettable that any people are killed, any civilians are killed, but they're not killing many civilians. This doesn't look like your normal punishment campaign, where thousands of people are killed in one evening's worth of strikes. So it may be collateral damage. But again, it's just very hard to say, given that both sides are engaged in a propaganda war, and given that, people like us, as close as we follow this conflict, just don't know that much about a good number of issues.
Yeah, I know that at various points in the war, we've seen where some of the air defense interceptor missiles that didn't hit the target later came down in the city. That was actually fairly common, at least earlier in the war, that I had seen specific reports of. There's also the possibility that Russian missiles can simply be off target, hit the wrong thing. And then there's also some that the Russians admitted to, and this has been about 6 or so months since I last saw a report like this, to where they said, yeah, because you had military forces in that place. We know you did. And so it was a civilian building, an apartment building, and we hit it intentionally because that's where you had military forces. I've actually talked to one person, a British NGO person who was on the ground in Ukraine earlier in the war, and said they firsthand saw that frequently the Ukraine side would put military forces into civilian areas, to try to hide them or whatever. I think according to the laws of war, that's actually legal, but then it makes it a target. Now, I can't say that that's the case here. In fact, I have no idea at all. But it wouldn't surprise me if any of those, or maybe Russia is actually just trying to take out some civilian targets for some purpose. It's hard for me to say, but bottom line is, as long as this war continues to go on, this kind of destruction will continue one way or the other.
Well, Danny, what if you had a situation where you had 150 NATO advisors who were in Ukraine, they're in Kyiv, and they went out for breakfast at a restaurant, and the Russians hit that restaurant and they killed all those NATO people? That would be, I think, a legitimate military strike. It wouldn't be an attack on civilians. Of course, in the process, they would invariably end up killing civilians. So that may be what happened in some of these cases. I'm not saying it did. Again, it's very hard to know exactly what's going on here because, again, we're dealing with a propaganda war on both sides.
Indeed. Yeah, that's why it is so hard to cut through some of this stuff. We can only see what did happen. And we can only left to speculate on what may have been the reason behind it, et cetera. Before we leave the whole topic of the Russian air war, I want to look at an interesting thing, because this may fit into your theme of propaganda war. Because when you look at the number of Russian drones, especially in recent months, they have significantly increased in frequency and in the number of going through, as well as the type of drones being used for these long-range strikes are increasing in their sophistication. Here is one, and I think this was the Wall Street Journal that was publishing this. This is the number of drones and missile strikes in a day, and it shows that the number of those that were intercepted by the Ukraine side are claimed to be, and those that were not intercepted. In this chart, that people probably can't read a lot of this stuff, but you see this, the mainly the yellow or gold color is what Ukraine claims that they intercepted, in the small purple area that's kind of on the top of each of these clips is what Ukraine claims end up getting through. It seems to me that the claims that they're shooting down virtually everything is a little bit spurious when I see so many targets actually getting hit. And the interesting thing is that the number of drones that got through that Ukraine claims almost doesn't change if there's just a handful of missiles firing or if there's a huge number of missiles firing. In fact, you can see the biggest spike in the middle of that toward the middle or so of July, when I believe there was like 700 fired. You see that according to the Ukraine, every one of them were shot down, but just tiny little dot of purple at the top. But then meanwhile, when you look at some of the lower spikes, they show that sometimes a pretty substantial number of purple gets through. So I'm not sure how those things fit together, but it just goes to show, at least to me, you really can't believe what anybody's saying that you can't physically validate on the ground.
Well, I think, Danny, this fails the common sense test. I mean, we know that the Russians, by Ukrainian accounts, have significantly increased the number of drones that they're firing at Ukraine. And you saw that, of course, on the chart. And furthermore, by Ukrainian accounts, the quality or the lethality of those drones has gone up over time. And at the same time, the ability of the Ukrainians to defend themselves has deteriorated over time. The Ukrainians again say this. So if all those things are true, how can the Ukrainians be shooting down almost all of these massive drones that are being launched at them on a nightly basis? It just doesn't make any sense. And then I'd come at this from a slightly different angle. when I look at Ukrainian claims about the number of Russians who have died versus the number of Ukrainians who have died in this war, the numbers that the Ukrainians push forward, and of course that the West echoes, make no sense at all. The Ukrainian casualties have to be at least twice as big as the number of Russian casualties, given the deep-seated imbalance in firepower between the two sides, which of course favors the Russians. But nevertheless, the Ukrainians and people in the West claim that the Russians have suffered far more casualties than the Ukrainians. Again, this fails the common sense test, and it tells you that the Ukrainians and their minions in the West are lying. It's the propaganda war. And I think the same basic logic applies with regard to the chart on drones that you just put up.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so hard to parse even truth from fiction, and then that extends into some other areas. So, kind of keeping with the theme of the propaganda war, let's go to what the Europeans are trying to say that they want to get done in this peace process that President Trump has begun. And one of the key areas there's a couple of key ones. One is troops on the ground to peacekeepers to patrol any kind of agreement that is eventually made. And then the second one is security guarantees. That was raised in Kyiv, I think it was yesterday, by a British Admiral Radkin. Tony Radkin, I think his name is. Gary, yeah, there, thank you. It says the UK and France have made it very clear that this is our commitment. We will look for opportunities for a military presence in Ukraine. We want to support Ukraine, ensure European aircraft in your skies, guarantee safe skies for you, and join Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria in ensuring security in the Black Sea. So Great Britain and France are clearly saying this, and we are negotiating with other partners about their level of commitments in terms of providing security guarantees with troops. What chance does this have to fly in any kind of a negotiated that the Russians would agree to?
Well, if we're saying that there's going to be a peace settlement, this is an agreement that both the Russians sign on to and the Ukrainians in the West sign on to, there are going to be no meaningful security guarantees from the West. And there are going to be no boots on the ground in Ukraine. So you can't have a meaningful peace agreement and at the same time have NATO troops in Ukraine. It just doesn't work. What that tells you is the only way you're going to get NATO troops into Ukraine is if you get a ceasefire, which I don't think you're going to get, and you put those troops in there. And once you put those troops in there, the Russians have made it clear that they're going to put their gun sights on those troops. And the question is, in that fight between NATO troops and Russian troops, who do you think is going to prevail? And if I had to bet, I'd bet on the Russians, especially if you're talking about putting the British and the French and other European troops in there, because they don't have large numbers of troops and the quality of their troops leave much to be desired. The British don't even have the equivalent of one armored division. I sort of don't understand what these people are talking about. But of course, what they're talking about is not using these troops to fight against the Russians. But as I said to you before, they're not going to be able to get a peace agreement. We're not going to be able to get a peace agreement with the Russians that allows for security guarantees or for troops on the ground.
You know, it's funny. I think it was this past weekend. It might have been toward the end of last week that Lavrov floated the idea that, hey, if you want some peacekeepers on the ground, what we might agree to is the permanent members of the UNSC, which would include French and British, but would also include Chinese and Russian. So he said, yeah, we might kind of think that. And then I think it was a couple of days ago, maybe even Monday, Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for the Kremlin, addressed it like this.
Europe is putting forward proposals for security guarantees for Ukraine, which include, in particular, a European military presence in Ukraine and observers from certain third countries. What do you think about these proposals?
We are negative about this and have said so at various levels. There is no such thing as a European military. There are the militaries of individual countries, most of which are NATO members. NATO's military infrastructure and its infiltration into Ukraine are among the root causes of the conflict. This is why we are negative about these discussions.
You know, it's ironic because Sean Bell on Sky News earlier this week had a big old one of those big TVs they have with the graphic, and he's saying, let's take a look at what it would take actually to do that. If Russia agreed to it, and you just heard there that they haven't changed any of their views, but he said that if you took France and UK militaries that are their total deployable forces that they even have to give would be about 10% of each of the total that would be necessary, which he calculated in terms of rotation and, the troops on the ground would be about 300,000 if it was one per 60 meters or something like that. One person per 60 meters of the 100-kilometer front to be able to patrol that. And he said then they would have like maybe 30% possibility, and no one knows where that other 70% would come from, even to have a very thin picket line. So there are physical restrictions against that, and then there is the diplomatic restrictions against it. So why do we keep talking about something that we can't produce?
Danny, I think in a very important way, you're missing the most significant limit that the French and British face, and that is the state of their economies. These are countries that are in real trouble. The idea that they can afford to continue supporting Ukraine and building large-scale military forces to deploy to Ukraine is not a serious argument. People want to pay attention to what's happening to the British economy and what's happening to the French economy. These are two economies, and I'd throw the German economy in as well, that are in really serious trouble. And these countries are in no position to take on the burden of securing Ukraine's future.
So, well, then that just deepens my question then. Why then are we talking, whether it's General Radican there, whether it's Macron, whether it's Keir Starmer, Ursula von der Leyen, why are they keeping on pushing something that they can't afford or can't produce on the ground and is rejected by Russia? What is the intent here?
I have no explanation for this other than to say I think they're just detached from reality. I watch this.
Okay.
I scratch my head and say, what are these people thinking? The Russians have told us at least 10,000 times that they will not tolerate NATO troops in Ukraine. They will not tolerate the West giving a security guarantee to Ukraine. But we keep insisting on that. And we're talking about putting large-scale forces into Ukraine when the assets are just not there. We talk about continuing to support Ukraine with weaponry when the weaponry is not on the shelf to give to them. This is all delusional. And at the same time, of course, just to take this a step further, the Ukrainians are in terrible shape on the battlefield. Even in the Western media, if you read carefully, you see a huge amount of evidence that supports that point. And there's no way we can rectify the situation. I just scratch my head and wonder what these people are smoking.
There must be a lot of it, whatever there is, because it afflicts a majority of the mainstream leaders in Europe. Unfortunately, it's not just Europe that has some questions and some challenges dealing with reality. It seems also to be in the United States. Now, we give President Trump some props for at least being willing to entertain the possibility of peace and actively trying to get it. But then some of his actions are also head scratchers, like this selecting out India to be used as a cudgel here. Because this, I guess, just yesterday, it officially went into effect an additional 25% tariff on India for using Russian oil. That's more perplexing because during Trump's alleged 50-day timeline that he first gave to Russia to have an unconditional 30-day ceasefire, which was then shortened to 10, he said there would be a number of countries in these bone-crushing sanctions, whatever specifically was mentioned, China, India, Brazil, and then a number of other people. But for some reason, before that deadline came, he did slap this tariff on India, which finally went into effect yesterday. And earlier, Peter Navarro was asked to explain some of his logic behind this. And, well, this kind of makes your head scratch, too.
50%. Are we actually in talks with India right now? Is there a potential for a deal to change that number?
Look, it's real easy. India can get 25% off tomorrow if it stops buying Russian oil and helping to feed the war machine. Russia uses the money it gets to fund its war machine, kill more Ukrainians, and then the next thing that happens, of course, is Ukraine comes to us and Europe and says, give us some more money. So everybody in America loses because of what India's doing.
Yeah, there's got to be more to this, John. I mean, help me understand why select India when we have so much more to lose international, diplomatically, economically, even by not doing this. What do you think?
Let me just start by saying this is a colossal blunder on our part. It's hard to believe. But what's going on here? We have no leverage against Russia. That's the problem here. And everybody talks about secondary sanctions. That's maybe the best tool in the toolbox. Secondary sanctions means you don't sanction Russia because they're so sanctioned up that there are no more meaningful sanctions you can put on them. So what you do is you sanction countries that trade with Russia. And the two principal targets here are China and India. That's who secondary sanctions are aimed at. The problem with China is we have no leverage over them. We tried to get tough with them earlier this year, and we found out very quickly that they have a lot of leverage over us. So you can't put secondary sanctions on China. You can't put sanctions on China for trading or for importing oil from Russia. So that leaves India. And the fact is, it won't work with India either. The Indians have made it clear that they will not cut off the importation of oil from Russia. We refuse to accept that message, and we therefore put secondary sanctions on India. They won't work, as I just said, because the Indians are not going to cave. And second, what you are doing is you're driving the Indians into the arms of the Russians and the Chinese. And this is especially important with regard to the Chinese. But what's happened here is that over the past 25 years, the United States has gone to great lengths to improve its relations with India. And some of this was due to what President Trump did in his first term. So when Trump moved into the White House this past January, relations between the United States and India were really terrific. And for the purposes of containing China, which is our principal foreign policy mission, having good relations with India is essential. But what's happened since then, and now with these secondary sanctions, is we have poisoned relations with India. The Indians are furious with us, almost to a person. Trump has tried to call Modi 4 times, and Modi refuses to talk to him. And furthermore, Modi is moving closer to the Chinese, and he's moving closer to the Russians. So this not only doesn't work, it's indeed counterproductive. Nevertheless, here we are.
But so, I mean, maybe I'm asking you something that you can't answer, but those things that you mentioned wouldn't have been hard for anybody to figure out, especially those who were actually, in contact with the upper echelons between the two countries. That result would have been predictable, yet they did it anyway, and they only did it with India. There can't have been any actual thought that, well, maybe this will cause India to stop buying Russian oil and it really will impact the Russian economy, because that stuff takes a long time to unwind anyway. Can you come up with any other kind of rational thought, even if we don't agree with it, what the administration may have thought it could gain by this?
No. Almost everybody I know and respect, including people who are on the other side of the divide from people like us, Danny, think this is crazy. Right? There's nobody out there who's applauding this move except for people like Peter Navarro. I don't understand what the story is as to how this has a happy ending. Are they going to make the argument that India is going to cave, that we have coercive leverage over India to the point where we can bring the Indians to their knees? Is that the argument? I don't know anybody who believes that, and everything India has done so far says that argument is wrong. But maybe they have special information, special intelligence that tells them the Indians will cave. I don't know, but almost everybody I know who I respect, and again, this includes people on the other side of the divide from us, does not think this is going to work.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly in that same category as you, but it gets a little bit even more puzzling when you go. I'm going to go back to that same interview there, and Navarro's going to mention somebody else that also is getting Russian oil who will not be tariffed.
If everybody, including Europe, this is like Europe's still buying Russia oil, which is crazy, okay? If people just stop buying Russia oil, then it's only a matter of time before Putin doesn't have the money to fund that war. So Modi's a big part.
Yeah, so Modi's a big part of that. So he says, but then he just literally bypasses that European countries are. And by the way, there's been an issue with Zelensky using Ukrainian assets to blow up the Druzhba pipeline inside of Russia, which then had negative impacts on Slovakia and Hungary. And they were not very happy about that either. So Zelensky seems to be saying, actually, he did say, you either play ball with me or maybe it could get worse. I mean, what do you make of that whole dynamic there with the European component?
Again, the Europeans are not going to stop buying Russian oil. His key word is if this, if that. Well, that's not going to happen. The Indians are not going to bend. The Europeans are not going to bend. And the Chinese are not going to bend. We are where we are. Sanctions won't work. Again, Danny, what you want to understand here is we're desperate. We're desperate. We have no tools that we can use against the Russians to affect the course of the war. And what's happening here, it's very important to understand this, is that more and more people are beginning to recognize that Ukraine is going to lose the war. And that means NATO is going to lose the war. And this is going to have devastating consequences. And they're doing everything they can to see if they can find some instrument that will allow us to rescue the situation, or at least stabilize the situation, if not turn it around. And, they talk about sending this new weapon or that new weapon, and we all know that that takes us nowhere. And then they talk about sanctions, and you can't sanction the Russians anymore, so you go to secondary sanctions. And they don't work either. The evidence is quite clear. But nevertheless, we try to sanction India. And what is the consequence of this? It backfires. It not only doesn't work, it backfires. And this just shows you what the quality of the leadership in the West is. It's really quite distressing, to put it mildly.
Yeah, you say that a number of people are finally starting to come to the realization that Ukraine can't avoid losing. But there is going to be those hardcore folks who are going to stick to the plan, especially among the Western elite. And we have to include the United States in that, either detached from reality or they have some other nefarious motivation that I can't identify. But here is David Petraeus on the ABC News 4 days ago saying, here's where we are.
What should be clear to all, and I think it is even clear to President Trump, is that despite all of his efforts, again, which we applaud, to end a war, to stop the killing, Vladimir Putin clearly has no intention of doing that unless he's given additional territory, which is heavily fortified, and Russian forces would have to fight for years at the pace that they're going. He wants to displace President Zelensky, replace him with a pro-Russian figure, and frankly to demilitarize Ukraine, none of which can be acceptable to Ukraine nor to the European countries and the United States. In fact, by the way, President Zelensky, under the Ukrainian constitution, doesn't even have the authority to declare that certain territory would be controlled by the Russians. That would have to go to a national referendum. So again, I think it should be clear. The obstacle to peace at this point in time is President Putin. And what we need to do is change those dynamics by helping Ukraine far more than we have so far, lifting restrictions on them, seizing the $300 billion of frozen reserve in European countries of Russian money, giving it to Ukraine, more sanctions on Russia, even including the Gazprom bank and curtailing the export of oil further than we have already.
Okay, lots unpacking there, but I thought it was rich toward the first of this that he's accusing Russia of wanting to put a puppet regime in Kyiv to their liking when we pretty much facilitated that very thing in the reverse in 2014. But yeah, there's that. But let's look at some of the specifics, because he said in order to switch this, in order to change the outcome so that, as you say, many people are recognizing Ukraine can't win, he wants to change that. So we have to start doing things like seizing Russian assets and continue to do more sanctions and cut off this oil. Any possibilities there?
Well, again, he talked about sanctions, and we've just gone through that. That won't work, putting secondary sanctions on Russia is a non-starter. Then there's the whole question of seizing Russian assets. If this was a workable way of punishing the Russians and affecting events on the battlefield, the Biden administration would have done it. And indeed, the Trump administration would have done it. We can go out and do it, but it's not going to matter very much. There are all sorts of questions about the legality of such a move. But even if you put that aside and do it again, it's just not going to matter. The truth is, we've lost this war. The truth is, we made a major blunder thinking that we could bring the Russians to their knees and knock them out of the ranks of the great powers. And the Russians are doing very well on the battlefield relative to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are in deep trouble. And I want to emphasize here that whatever you think of Trump's policies towards Ukraine, he is slowly but steadily backing off from supporting Ukraine. He's turning the responsibility for helping Ukraine wage war against Russia to the Europeans. He's passing the buck here ever so subtly. Trump understands that this is a losing war, and he doesn't want to be blamed for it. And he sees no point in continuing to throw good money down a rat hole. So he's backing off. The Europeans can buy weapons from us and give them to the Ukrainians. So if you think the Ukrainians are in trouble on the battlefield, which most people now think is the case, and then you factor into that the fact that the United States is beginning to pull away from supporting Ukraine, tell me how the situation just doesn't get worse for Ukraine. And the answer is it does get worse for Ukraine. And you have people like Petraeus who are heavily invested in this war because he supported it fervently from the beginning. He's one of those people who thought the 2023 Ukrainian offensive was going to look like the German offensive against France in 1940. And when that didn't turn out to be the case, he supported every other cockamamie move that the Ukrainians have made. And the end result is that Ukraine is in a catastrophic situation. This has been a disastrous war for Ukraine. And people like Petraeus are searching. They're searching hard to see if they can find some sort of way out of this mess. But there is no way out of this mess.
Yeah, we actually, in a show earlier today, put that very clip on of Petraeus. People can go back and watch the whole thing there. You can see the context of it. So it was shameful when those two things are juxtaposed. But here's the thing, though. If Trump does recognize that, as you say, and if he is kind of starting to back off, then make the Navarro thing make sense with India, because those things would seem to be contradictory. The Trump administration, if it thought it was a losing prospect, you wanted to get away, it wouldn't harm us in the process, would it?
I think, who knows for sure what's going on.
I know that I put you in a no-win situation there. There's no answer for that. It's just, it is.
But one could argue that Trump, in a very important way, is trying to do a lot of things that some people think might work, so that when the situation in Ukraine really goes to hell in a handbasket, he can't be blamed. He can say, I employed secondary sanctions. He can say, I did not cut off the flow of American weaponry to Ukraine. I just insisted that it go through Europe and the Europeans pay for it. You see, he knows he has to position himself so people can't say Donald Trump lost the war. He has to say, I did everything I could to prevent defeat. And one could argue that putting secondary sanctions on India fits that policy. But I'm speculating here again.
Yeah.
Very hard to figure out what Trump is doing because, as you know as well as I do, he changes his position from day to day. And the rationales that he gives vary as much as the policy positions.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. So that leaves us in a situation like this. And that means the Europeans, Ukrainians, and at least on policy level, the United States are pursuing something that cannot be accomplished by looking for leverage points on Russia that don't exist. Meanwhile, even if NATO countries are paying for these weapons, and it remains to be seen how much they actually pay, we don't have enough of them to give. So you're not going to be able to provide any kind of, like we did in 2023 for that big offensive, not a shred of, not a fraction of that much is even available to go in. Ukraine's manpower continues to shrivel. Their desertions continue to rise, and the Russian production capacity continues to escalate. So given all of those dynamics, not to mention the Russian manpower pool, what is going to happen over the next 6 to 9 months, if I can ask you to pull out your crystal ball?
Well, I think at some point, the Ukrainian military, at least that part of the military that is east of the Dnieper River, is going to collapse. I find it hard to believe that this can go on, let's say, for another 9 months or 6 to 9 months. The Ukrainians, I mean, they don't have enough forces by their own admission to cover the front lines. As we've talked about before, if you're defending against Russian offensives, you have to be able to thickly populate the FIBA, the forward edge of the battle area. You have to have lots of troops up on the front line. You can't have a porous front line. And according to the Ukrainians themselves, they don't have enough troops. They're also short of artillery. They're badly outnumbered in terms of drones. If you look at the reserve forces that they have available, they don't have a strategic reserve anymore. They're actually pulling forces from one area of the battlefield, one area of the front line, to move to other areas of the front line when those other areas are threatened. So you just sort of say to yourself, how long can this last? And all the while this is happening, support for Ukraine in the West, especially in the United States, is beginning to weaken. So I don't see this war, at least the fighting on the eastern side of the Dnieper River, continuing for that much longer.
Yeah, and we'll just have to wait and see how that goes, because it's nearly impossible to predict how long a force can hold together. I've seen in history some forces that broke quickly and some that lasted a long time. I mean, you can look at the Nazis. I mean, they themselves maintained continuity, at least all the way to the literal bitter end. So one never knows how far it can go, but I think the end is known. It's just whether it's going to be quick or slow. Do you see it any different?
Yeah, I think that in case of the Wehrmacht in World War II, they never broke. It's a quite amazing story, and there's a whole literature on why this was the case. But we all know that in World War I, Imperial Germany's army did break, starting in the summer of 1918, and then clearly in the fall of 1918. That army just broke. It collapsed, and the Allies actually never set foot inside Germany before the army collapsed. With regard to the French in World War I, the French army basically collapsed in May of 1917. That's when the mutinies took place. The French army was able to reconstitute itself, and thankfully the Americans came in, and the Americans and the British helped keep the French going until the end of the war. But I think the French army was in deep trouble by 1917. So exactly, what happens with the Ukrainian army is hard to say. One point I would make in that regard, Danny, is it's quite clear that support for the war on the home front is evaporating. You've seen these polls where well over 50% of the population is in favor of a negotiated settlement. The Ukrainian people have lost their appetite for the war. And as they see things deteriorate, I'm sure that the number of people who think that it's time to settle this war will increase. And as that happens, and as events on the battlefield deteriorate, I think those two things together will push towards a Russian victory on the eastern side of the Dnieper.
Yeah, well, we'll continue to monitor that and see how things progress, but that seems to be the most logical and plausible. In the amount of time we have left, I want to shift gears to the Middle East and kind of get your view on something there. In late October of 2023, following the Hamas terrorist actions that killed a lot of Israeli civilians, the Israeli Defense Forces invaded Gaza City at that time. They started off in the north and went in there. And I remember arguing at the time that the Netanyahu government was committing to using military force to achieve a political outcome that was impossible to achieve because of how they were going about conducting their affairs. That has now been borne out over now closing in on 2 years it's going on there. And it doesn't appear that the Israeli Defense Forces have learned any lessons from it, because now they appear to be doubling down on it and going in further back again into Gaza City, although this time probably with more bulldozers than they are with tanks, to literally demolish the city. And the civilian casualty toll just keeps going through the roof. What do you make of what is going on in that place?
Well, the key to understanding what's going on in Gaza is that the Israelis' principal goal here is to ethnically cleanse Gaza. It's to drive the Palestinians out. And to do that, what they want to do is make Gaza unlivable. And at the same time, find some countries or a country that will take in those 2.3 or 2.2 million Palestinians who now occupy Gaza. And what they're interested in doing is driving the Palestinians from the northern part of Gaza, which is where Gaza City is, into an enclave in the south, concentrating them, and then eventually moving them out of Gaza. The problem that the Israelis face is that they can't find a country or countries that will take the Palestinians. So the Palestinians remain in Gaza. And the Israeli solution for dealing with this problem involves the continuous killing of Palestinians. This is why the genocide continues and will continue. The Israelis are not interested in some sort of meaningful peace settlement with or without Hamas. They don't want the Palestinians in Gaza. They want the Palestinians out of Gaza. And by the way, they want the Palestinians out of the West Bank. They want to ethnically cleanse Greater Israel. And it's not politically correct to say that in the mainstream media in the West. And we play all these games where we say that Israel's principal goal is to neutralize Hamas, get the hostages back. Yes, they want to do those two things, but the principal overriding goal is to ethnically cleanse. But they can't cleanse until they can figure out a way to get rid of the Palestinians. It's very important to understand that. So the Palestinians are there, and they are continuing, the Israelis, to try to make the place more and more unlivable, giving the West, giving the Palestinians, and giving some countries in the Arab and Islamic world an incentive to move, to transfer. But that involves the genocide. So the genocide will continue to go on.
And, you know, now I've read some reports just earlier today that on the southern part here, just south of Rafah, where there is the gate here, that many in the Israeli government continue to put pressure on Egypt to open these gates and say that there's actually it's the Egyptians' fault as to why all these people are stacking up around here about what was Rafah. I don't know if you can even call it a town anymore, but some of these areas down here, because they're saying, hey, just open the gates, through the Philadelphia corridor, and then, there'll be people that can live without being fear of anything. What do you make of those claims? And will Egypt ever actually open that gate?
Well, I think what you're talking about dovetails perfectly with what I was saying. The Egyptians will not open those gates. The Egyptians will go to enormous lengths to make sure those gates remain closed, because the Egyptians don't want 2+ million Palestinians flowing into Egypt. They have made that unequivocally clear. The Israelis, of course, are relentless, and they are pushing and pushing and pushing. The Egyptians are fully aware of that, and they're going to great lengths to resist the Israelis. And of course, the Israelis, in typical fashion, say it's not their fault. It's the Egyptians' fault. But it's not the Egyptians' fault. This genocide is a result of Israeli policy. Until they can drive all the Palestinians out, they will continue to inflict horrific punishment on the Palestinians.
So let me ask you a question that now moving to your international theorist hat on. You certainly are well aware of all the things that went into the apartheid government in South Africa and how it was dominant for many, many decades before finally external pressure began to change that dynamic there. And then they ended up seeing the changes. Do you see any potential replay of that in regards to global pressure on the government of Israel, or is this just a completely different animal?
Well, Israel benefits greatly from the fact that in almost every Western country, there is a powerful lobby that goes to great lengths to make sure that policymakers in those Western countries are not terribly critical of Israel and basically go along with what Israel is doing. And you certainly see this in the United States with both the Biden administration and the Trump administration. So I think a lot of Israelis think that they can get away with their barbaric behavior because the lobby has their back, which is another way of saying Western countries have their back. But the whole question of where this all leads is a different matter. The fact is that given the internet and given the fact that this genocide has taken place in ways that make it possible for a vast number of people around the world to see what is going on, and furthermore, given the fact that you have shows like this show and countless other shows of this sort that not only expose what the Israelis are doing, but are critical of the Israelis, Israel has ended up with its reputation being badly and permanently stained. This is, from a public relations point of view, a disaster for Israel. Furthermore, all of this kind of barbaric behavior inside Israel is going to have consequences on the body politic inside of Israel. I think a lot of secular, more moderate Israeli Jews are going to leave the country. I think the country is going to become more right-wing, if that's possible, with the passage of time. And I think that it will be a country that is in real trouble. Its sense of itself will be badly undermined. And people all around the world will look on Israel in, I think, very negative ways, in ways that has not been the case in the past. And if you look at public opinion polls, by the way, in the United States, it's quite clear that young Americans, including young Jews, have very critical views of Israel, much more so than older Americans and older Jews. And of course, those older Americans and older Jews are eventually going to die, and you're going to have more and more younger people who are going to be critical of Israel. So you have to ask yourself, moving forward 20, 30 years, what does Israel look like, given the fact that it has been unable to solve this problem? The problem is likely to linger. I'm talking about the Palestinian problem, and that they're likely to continue to act in barbaric ways. I mean, what does this mean? And then when you get inside Israel itself and you look at the demographics, 13% of the population is now ultra-Orthodox. By the year 2035, given birth rates, about 30% of Israel's population will be ultra-Orthodox. Many of those ultra-Orthodox Jews are remarkably hardline, and they're not the sort of people who have close ties with the West, who generate a lot of sympathy in the West. So I think with the passage of time that Israel's image in the West will be badly damaged, and it will make it increasingly difficult for countries in the West or for governments in the West to support Israel the way they have in the past. And again, I think if you look at what happens inside Israel, just put the West aside, you look at what happens inside Israel, it's not a pretty picture. It's absolutely horrible what's happening now. And again, I think the situation is just going to continue because the Israelis have been unable to solve their so-called Palestinian problem.
And in fact, let me ask you, in the time we have left, real quickly, a couple of different scenarios. So let's look at one which would seem to be very unlikely on the surface, but work with me here. Let's say that somehow there's some passage, whether it's Ethiopia, somewhere in Africa, who knows where, but somebody says, yeah, we're willing to take a lot of the Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip, and they end up going in some large number, or even weirder, Egypt opens the gates and they are successful at getting the Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip, which so many in Israel actually want. What happens to the approximate 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank? Because with that kind of success, it seems pretty likely to me that the Israeli government will then do the screws now to try to get the Palestinians out of there. How do you see that unfolding?
Well, they'll go to great lengths to push the Palestinians out of the West Bank. I mean, the idea here is to create a greater Israel that's basically filled with Israeli Jews.
But how would they get past? So right now they're still trolling on October 7th. That's what drives everything. Hamas, whatever. They wouldn't have an October 7th or a Hamas to accuse in that case. How would they justify that in front of the world?
Well, the thing is that you didn't have an October 7th on October 6th. And the Israelis had worked out a modus operandi for dealing with the fact that the Palestinians were not going anywhere. The Palestinians in Gaza were not going anywhere. But then this event happened on October 7th. They saw an opportunity to cleanse. And I think that with regard to the West Bank, the basic view is that eventually there'll be an opportunity. There'll be some sort of conflict that will allow them to go to great lengths to push the Palestinians out of the West Bank. But Danny, you also want to remember, in the meantime, the Israelis are doing horrible things on the West Bank
right
as
now.
we speak. Yeah, exactly. It's not like they are accepting the status quo. They're going to great lengths to make life miserable for the Palestinians, to do everything they can to make the West Bank unlivable for Palestinians. Now, it's a fundamentally different situation than what you see in Gaza, because what's happening in Gaza is a genocide, and you don't see a genocide taking place on the West Bank. But nevertheless, the Israelis are in the process of doing the preliminary work for ethnically cleansing the West Bank, and that is their goal. Their goal, you want to understand, is to end up conquering territory and integrating into Israel in southern Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, I believe, in Egypt. I believe they'd take back the Sinai if they could. They have a very ambitious strategy when it comes to Lebensraum. And furthermore, they want to drive the Palestinians out. They want a state that's basically filled with nothing but Israeli Jews.
Well, yeah, that's about as hideous and barbaric as can be imagined, and it's unfortunately it's unfolding in front of everybody's eyes. And even when those things are happening, all it's necessary. So up to this point is for the Israelis to just make declarative statements like they did at the Nasser hospital the other day, where they just said, oh, no, there was a Hamas guy with a camera. That's why we shot. We didn't actually kill a lot of innocent people. And then it just gets accepted. So I guess as long as that continues on, this barbaric activity will continue on. Last question I have for you here.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing very quickly. I don't believe they get away with their lies anymore. They do with Israel's supporters in the United States. There's no question about that. Mike Huckabee, for example, believes this. You know, the people who run the ADL or AIPAC, they believe this. These Israeli denials. But the problem that the Israelis face is that the vast majority of people don't believe this.
You mean a vast majority of people around the world, or even in the U.S.?
Even in the U.S., you know, a poll was recently released. This is really quite remarkable. That shows that 67% of Americans who are Democrats, they're in the Democratic Party, 67% believe Israel is committing genocide or something akin to genocide in Gaza. And another 8% believe it's not genocide, but it's effectively mass murder. 67 plus 8 is 75. That's 75% of Democrats. 3 out of every 4 Democrats believes that Israel is either committing genocide, that's 67%, or genocide plus mass murder, that's 75%. This is really remarkable because this is in a country where the mass media, where the New York Times, especially the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, rarely ever use the word genocide to describe what Israel is doing in Gaza. Yet 75% of American Democrats believe that Israel is committing either genocide or mass murder.
And what did that poll say about the Republicans?
Oh, it's almost exactly the opposite. It's really quite amazing the difference between Republicans and Democrats on this issue.
And one wonders where those Democrats were when Joe Biden was in office doing the same thing that Trump is doing, but that's a separate issue. But that leads me into the last question that I had, though, is that remains possible as long as the government in the United States continues to do what it's done diplomatically and militarily and financially to help the Israelis. But what would happen if some unforeseeable time in the possibly near future, we have an economic crisis on our own side here and maybe a severe recession or so where we're not able to provide all of that kind of support to the Israeli side? If they ever lose the blanket support they have from the whatever administration it's in the Oval Office at any time, what would that effect have on the ground in Israel?
2 points, Danny. First of all, it's very important to understand, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, that Israel is extremely dependent on the United States. Israel could not behave the way it does without robust support from the United States, right? When people talk about Israel does this or Israel does that, they should really be saying Israel and the United States, because we are joined at the hip, and they could never execute this super ambitious and super murderous foreign policy without the full support of the United States. So it's just very important to understand this. Second point I would make to you is even if you had a depression or a severe recession, I believe we would still continue to support Israel. And the reason is the power of the Israel lobby. You just cannot underestimate how powerful it is. It's, again, politically incorrect to say this in the United States. To talk about the power of the lobby is sure to get you into trouble, as I can attest to. But the fact is, the lobby is incredibly powerful.
So if let's just say that as is probably pretty likely that the Democrats retake control of the House in 2026, what do you think is going to happen to that 75% Democratic opinions then?
Well, I think it's extremely unlikely that the Democratic leadership would crack down in a meaningful way on Israel. One could argue that, in 10, 15, 20 years, the situation will change. I don't know. But that situation is not going to change anytime soon. In fact, what's happening here is that this issue is causing the Democratic Party huge problems. I mean, you have this complete disconnect between the leadership and the rank and file. The rank and file, 75% of the rank and file believe that Israel is committing either genocide or mass murder. And by the way, if you look at that poll, this includes Republicans and Democrats. 1/3 of the American people think that what Israel is doing is not serving America's interests. Just think about that. 1/3 of the American people believe that what Israel is doing is not serving the U.S. national interest. This, of course, raises the question, then why are we doing this? And the answer is very simple. It's because of the power of the lobby.
Yeah.
American policymakers live in fear that if they do anything that's seen as anti-Israel, they'll be smeared in public and they'll be defeated at the polls.
And look, too many times that's exactly how it's worked out. That's not an unjust or unrealistic fear. It has happened before. But anyway, listen, we'll certainly leave it there. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Really appreciate you coming on. And one of our hallmarks is we're unintimidated and uncompromised to tell the truth. And you have not backed down from that today, saying things that are in politics someplace, but accurate. And we really value that. Thank you so much.
You're more than welcome, Danny. I look forward to seeing you the next time.
All right. And there's if you don't get enough of John coming on our show there, he's got his Substack at substack.com/@Mearsheimer. So you can get more of John in between now and then. Thank you very much. And we'll see y'all on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.